Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture from Music 1300. My name is Professor George. Today we're going to be talking about cliques. We're going to investigate rhythm a little bit further and go beyond the confines of simple time and talk a little bit about compound time and asymmetrical time. At this point, it's going to be important to make sure that you have a page of your own, a blank page to take notes. My one page that I've prepared for you for lecture. And we're going to go ahead and toggle over to my whiteboard so we can start taking notes on some old terms and learn some new ones. Okay, here we go. Let's go ahead and review some important terms. We talked about meter in our last lecture, and meter refers to the combination of stressed and unstressed events that happen in a piece of music. We have talked about one kind of metric field so far, and that is simple time or simple meter. And simple meter is where we're dividing or grouping our beats into groupings of two. It sort of has this very back forth feel to it in terms of how the music sounds. Our new terms that we're going to talk about today are different kinds of groupings of meter, combination of stressed and unstressed events. So simple meter, like we talked about last class, the division or grouping of two. We also have compound meter or compound time. And that is when we're grouping or dividing our meter into, or our rhythmic units into groupings of three. So we have this sort of stressed, unstressed, unstressed repeating pattern that happens. We also have a metric label where we are combining groupings of 2 and 3 together, and we call that asymmetrical time. So asymmetrical time means that we're using groupings of 2 and 3 within our metric field. So we have perhaps a combination of this plus this that's happening within a piece of music. So meter, the combination and repeating pattern of stressed and unstressed events. So meter is typically expressed in a convention we call a time signature. A time signature is a notational convention, which is always a number over a number that appears at the very beginning of a piece of music. The equation is always the same. The top number means the number of beats in the measure. Whereas the bottom number is the unit that gets the beat. We figured out through yesterday's class that this bottom number corresponds to the rhythm tree. And the rhythm tree is a really very neat and tidy way of how we express the durations that we encounter in a piece of music. So the rhythm tree, if you need to review, go back to the last lecture, but I'll go through it one more time here. This is a symbol that is a whole note, divides out into 2 half notes, further divides out into 4 quarter notes, further divides out into 2 eighth notes, These are all beamed together. We talked about that in our last class. So, sorry, whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note. And we can continue going down. These are 16th notes, in which there are 16 total, if we were to continue on this direction. And a 16th note further divides into two 32nd notes. We gain a beam every time we create a smaller duration. Wonderful. And again, 32 total. So each of these durations on the rhythm tree are, if you take layer by layer, equal the same amount of time. So I love to think about pi when I'm thinking about duration. So the whole note is a whole pi. If you divide out a whole note into two equal components, you get two half notes. If you consume both half notes, like if you play both half notes, it takes the same amount of time as a whole note. Your example, you're not cheating your diet if you happen to eat two half pies. You have indeed eaten a whole pie. Same thing for quarters. If you eat 4 quarters, you have actually eaten 1 whole. So each of these layers is exactly the same duration, but it's divided out differently. Each of these is also represented by a different number, and that number represents the unit that gets the beat in terms of the time signature. So a whole note. What happened here? Here we go. Is represented by the number 1, half note, 2, quarter note, 4, eighth note. You probably guessed it. 8, 16, 16th note, 16, and 32 for 32nd notes. So there are only so many options that you can have for the bottom number, but the top number is somewhat limitless. So to review, we talked about one time signature yesterday, or in our last class, and that was 4/4, okay? And what this means is that there are 4 beats in the measure, and the unit that is represented by the number 4 is what gets the beat. So if we look over at our rhythm tree, the quarter note is representing the number 4. So this is essentially saying quarter notes. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 of these symbols in every measure. And indeed, there's a stress that happens on beat 1 and 3 that kind of divide out our unit into 2 groupings of 2. And that is how we arrive at simple time. Groupings of 2. So let's talk about compound time. Groupings of 3. So there are a couple different ways that you can express compound time. Let's talk about one example, and that is 3/4. This literally says that there are 3 quarter notes in every measure. So again, the number of beats. The quarter note gets the beat. We have a stress structure where we hear 1 stressed, and then beats 2 and 3 are unstressed. So the rhythmic difference in terms of stress between simple meter and compound meter is usually simple meter goes around with a stress, unstress, stress, unstress, stress, unstress. Whereas compound meter has 1 stressed event and 2 unstressed events. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So in a way, compound time kind of feels more circular, whereas simple time kind of feels more back and forth, like a march. Awesome. So this is an example of compound time. There's also, in terms of meter and metric feels, kind of two ways of feeling 2 and 3 either apart from one another or combined together. We have something called simple compound time. Simple compound time is where we're feeling a big grouping of 3 with a smaller grouping of 2, or a larger grouping of 2 and a smaller grouping of 3. An example of a simple compound meter could be 6/8. All right, so again, the equation is always the same, number of beats. And the bottom number is the unit that gets the beat. So over at our rhythm tree, the 8 represents the 8th note. So this unit gets the beat. There are literally 6 of those units in every measure. So I'm gonna go ahead and draw some note heads. Usually 6/8, again, because it's a meter that comes with a particular combination of stressed and unstressed events, usually looks something like this, where we have 2 groupings of 3 8th notes, where we have stressed events that happen on each of these groupings of 3, and then unstressed events that happen right next to them. So if we were to count in numbers, 1 is a big deal, 2 and 3 not so much, 4, big deal, 5 and 6 not so much. Here's our grouping of 3, but there happen to be 2 of them. That's how we arrive at simple compound time. That one is very cool. Let me go ahead and demonstrate it to you. So I'm going to count numbers 1 through 6 and put an accent on 1 and 4. So it's going to sound like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Wonderful. Believe it or not, by using a little bit of math, we can arrive at the conclusion that 3/4 and 6/8 actually have the same number of 8th notes. Let me do some math for you. This quarter note over here is equal to 2 8th notes right here. If we have one quarter note equaling 2 8th notes, 3 times 2 is going to equal 6 8th notes. So they're the same number of 8th notes in each of these in a measure of 3/4 and 6/8. The difference here is actually just how those 8th notes are stressed. So here we go. If we're going to continue counting like consistent 8th notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is the sort of stress structure that happens within 3/4, usually when it's put right next to 6/8. So If I were to count consistent eighth notes just like I did in 6/8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, versus 6/8, which sounds like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Different kinds of expression of a simple compound time in a way. So this one we have groupings of 2 here, but ultimately it's in a larger grouping of 3. This is something that we call the difference between macro and micro rhythm or meter. Macro meaning the larger grouping, and micro meaning the small grouping. I think a lot about visual arts. Sometimes when I think about music, the idea of macro and micro kind of relates to the idea of putting something in the foreground and background. By prioritizing one, usually the macro, that's the thing that you're feeling first and foremost, and then there's the micro thing that is like this sort of smaller rhythmic unit. All right, last term that I want to throw out to you before we sort of start illustrating these within musical examples. And by the way, this is simple time. Yesterday was really nice and easy. I would again expect you, especially even if you had a really easy time with simple time, to probably review this particular lecture once more to make sure you truly understand it. But asymmetrical time is usually, I'll write it again over here, is usually when we have like an odd number on the top. Like 9 is an exception. 9 divides out equally into 3 groupings of 3, so it's a compound meter. But for example, why don't we say 5/8? 5/8. 5 requires a combination of 2 and 3 to arrive at the top number. Again, top number, number of beats. Bottom number, the eighth note gets the beat. So there are literally 5 eighth notes in every measure. This is a combination of 2 plus 3. Or you could easily group it in 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. These actually sound different because based on the grouping, you put a stress at the beginning of every single group. In this case, 1, 2, 3, or 1 and 3 would get stressed. In this case, 1 and 4 are stressed. The idea, though, is that like there's something about the macro rhythm that feels somewhat uneven. Let me give you, or sort of demonstrate to you what asymmetrical meter can sound like. I'm going to repeat or make an ostinato out of the first example of 5/8. So I'm going to put my hands down on beats 1 and 3 and then clap for beats 2, 4, and 5. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Great. 3 plus 2 actually feels different. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's one example of asymmetrical meter. You could very easily have 7 as a top number. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. That's one example of how you could break up 7/8. Or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Another way of breaking up 7/8. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. Another equally valid way of breaking up 7/8. So asymmetrical time doesn't have to adhere to a particular pattern, but usually has some sort of feeling of inconsistency. And that's because there's a smaller micro rhythm that's happening that's jumping between groupings of 2 and 3. Didn't think rhythm and meter could be so difficult, huh? So that's a whole page full of notes. What I would suggest is going through them, making sure that you can easily define what meter is, what time signature is, and then examples of different time signatures and meters, simple time, compound time, simple compound time, and asymmetrical time. Great. Once you're clear with those, we're going to talk about how some of these ideas are used within popular music of the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. We're going to have lots of ostinatos that we're going to listen to that are asymmetrical, and definitely the presence of more irregular rhythmic feels than we heard last time. So I will see you guys for part 2, where we will engage in a whole bunch of listening.